What is a gimmick? By definition, it represents a novel device or idea designed primarily to attract attention or increase appeal, often with little intrinsic value. Among characters in Genshin, gimmicks usually come in the form of a unique playstyle or attribute that's hard to come across, if not outright unique to just them. And depending on what that gimmick is, it can either be the shining virtue of them or a basket in which they made a mistake putting their eggs into. It comes down to how loose your definition of a gimmick may be. One person might classify Bennett's Circle Impact one-button playstyle as a gimmick, while another might think of Furina's HP manipulation as a gimmick. I think, for the sake of this video, the second half of the definition is where I would point to, often with little intrinsic value. Several units have been released over the years with an identity unique only to them, or at most a couple of units, an identity that has become what most people know them for. Some have played their cards well and found great success with them, such as Nilou, Xianyun, and Navia to name a few, due in part to focusing on more conventional priorities. Meanwhile, others haven't been able to pull much attention, and with Natlan's entire roster itself looking to be the most creative we've seen yet, I wanted to look at Genshin's gimmicky characters, going over what went wrong with a few of them, and how that can be prevented for future releases. One of the earliest characters I made a why no one place on was Chongyun, a cryo greatsword user whose main gimmick was that he could imbue his party with cryo infusion. To this day, he's the only one capable of doing this, and yet despite that, he falls short in almost every possible way, putting him close to the bottom in terms of relevance. Now, being a version 1.0 unit back when there was no point of reference for strength, everyone was all over the place when it came to power budget. The interesting thing is that failed gimmicky characters were still present all the way up until around version 4, I'd say. But considering version 4 was when Hoyo made an actual concerted effort to make all gimmicky characters good, that makes total sense. Even then, however, there were still a few duds. If that's the case, what determines if a gimmick is successful or not? 3 factors, all coincidentally starting with the letter P: power, practicality, and priority. Those are the main properties distinguishing the successful gimmicks from the failed ones. Let's take a look at Furina's gimmick. When Fontaine came out, there was a huge emphasis on health manipulation, evidenced by its early 5-star characters, Linny, Risley, and Neuvillette, who each have a mechanic entailing attacking at a certain health pool or draining their own HP. Not just that, but the artifacts that Marshall Say Hunter expressly played into that style by giving you bonus crit rate whenever your health increased or decreased. So it would be hard to say whether Furina's whole gimmick of health manipulation is actually a gimmick when there have been several instances of that before she even came out. Nonetheless, how she capitalized on it was what enabled her to be so successful. Her elemental skill enables her bubble friends to deal more damage to enemies in exchange for draining the party's health, playing nicely with her ultimate, which gives the team bonus damage upon racking up fanfare stacks through the gain or loss of health. From a power point of view, the proof is in the pudding. Furina's damage amplification at base reaches 75%, the highest you can achieve in a single buff. Further driving that home is the fact that it applies to the entire party simultaneously, not just the active character. With C1, that ceiling goes up to 100%, and at C3, it reaches 124, easily making her the best support in the game if pure damage is their main concern. Practicality-wise, Furina's ability to facilitate her own party's loss of health means you have a reliable way to sustain damage quote-unquote without having to directly take hits from enemies. All she really needs now is a healer to actually restore your party's health, and while she could theoretically do it on her own, it's better if you bring a full party healer along, Jean, Xianyun, Barbara, Baijiu, etc. Most players were going to bring a sustain unit anyway, as it's rare for a party to not have a healer or shielder to begin with. So practically speaking, using her was quite easy for all manner of players, free to play and pay to win alike. Finally, priority. Supply is always good, but it needs to be matched by demand. Given the meta shift in version 4 adding more presence to traditional damage output, Furina was in relatively high demand courtesy of her incredible damage amp and her own damage to boot. Even within teams that made use of reactions, you had more than enough incentive to bring her along anyway, since by increasing the personal damage of everyone in her party at the same time, that compensated for her otherwise average Hydro application, so you'd find her running with the likes of Clarent and I'll hate them as well. Sometimes you forego reactions altogether and run Mono Hydro, relying entirely on brute force to get the job done. By checking all 3 boxes, Furina's gimmick would inarguably be considered a successful one. Now, let's look at a few examples of gimmicks that didn't work out too well to see the other end of the spectrum. I already brought up the reasons why units like Dia, Remine, and Hydro Traveler didn't work out in my Veiled Characters video, which I highly recommend you check out, as these 2 videos go hand in hand with each other. Let's talk about some other examples instead. This might be a bit premature, but in all honesty, considering she's literally based on a gimmick, let's talk about why Emily didn't exactly appeal to many people when she first came out. Right now, I think her main problem is not her, but the circumstances surrounding her. She's an excellent example of a unit who has a gimmick and plays into it really well, but that alone isn't always enough for a character to be successful. Opening up with power, Emily has that and then some. Some might say she has too much damage. When attacking burning enemies, she can deal significantly increased damage to them. Her ability to attack off-field further supplements this. In fact, her off-field damage ranks among the highest in the game. Basically, if you can't apply burning, her DPS is some booty cheeks, but if you can apply burning, she literally 1v9s the game. Her perfume might as well be gunpowder at that point. Next comes practicality. Never has there been a more brain-dead character in the game. Okay, maybe there is, but Emily's up there for sure. She has incredible coverage, virtually the entire Spiral Abyss arena if you put her dead center. You can sort of think of her as Yaimiko mixed with Ganyu/Ayato. Her skill summons a case that regularly smacks nearby enemies with Dendro, just like how Miko's totems fire lightning at the nearest enemy. Additionally, Emily's ultimate has a random fire type attack in the same fashion as Ganyu and Ayato's respective bursts, where for a few seconds it rains down Dendro damage to nearby enemies and then ends with another cast of her skill like how Fisher leaves behind Das after using her burst. Combining the duration and consistent application of Emily's skill and burst, she is overflow uptime like you wouldn't believe. It takes no skill to play her other than getting burning, which means you need fire, lots and lots of fire. Anyone who can get pyro on targets over and over again is all you need for Emily to reach her full potential. What about priority? This is where she falls short. Despite being a very strong unit in her own right, Emily has a number of significant issues, not the least of which being that she doesn't really have a team to call her own. A lot of that has to do with the niche never having been explored before. Emily's is centered around burning, not the burning reaction itself, just having enemies around her affected by burning so she can increase her own damage. In essence, all Emily does is contribute damage for her team, and not much else beyond that. She's kind of like Chiori in that sense, and as you know, Chiori has the same issue of being quite good, but ultimately unnecessary in the eyes of many. If all you can do is offer damage, the only way you can benefit from synergistic elements is by receiving buffs, as Emily's purely talent driven, so right now, there's not a proper team for her. Granted, she can use most of the same supports that everyone else can like Farina, but in her current condition, the only thing she really does is bring a ton of personal damage, making it hard for her to really stand out. If say you want to run Mono Pyro for Alekino or Linny, you can swap out Xiangling for Emily, but all you're really getting is a bit more single target DPS at the cost of AoE. If you're running Forward Vaporize or Farina, there is room to put Emily in, but in that context, all she does is contribute damage, forcing her to compete against units who can buff up the entire team like Kazuha. If you're trying to use Emily primarily for Dendro application, most people already have Nahida, so as it stands, Emily has no priority. There's no motive to pull for and or use her. Now having said that, Kanish is another character with a burning/virgin oriented playstyle, and by the time you see this video, he will already be out. Having multiple units play into the same niche gives more potential priority for Emily on paper. She wants enemies on fire, Kanish wants enemies on fire. Sounds like a decent combo, right? Yes, but at the same time, Kanish's main goal is almost completely identical to Emily's. They're both personal damage dealers. While they can work together, her contribution to Kanish once again only comes in the form of her own damage, overlapping with potential supports that want to be paired up with them. For example, you're running Kanish plus Bennett and Xiangling. I swear to god, we can't escape Xiangling, this bitch is everywhere. Anyway, if you're running Kanish, his main squad will be Bennett and Xiangling, leaving your last body slot open. What is a good option for your fourth teammate? Ideally, someone who can boost damage, right? Farina, Zhongli if you're feeling lazy, Xingqiu or Yelan, and then swapping out Xiangling for Toma if you want to go Virgin, but really it's mostly Farina. Kind of hard to use her with only Bennett as a healer, but the payoff is more than worth it. Emily is still a great party member to have with Kanish, but she's not the only one, nor is she the best one either. So until we get units or support that directly play off her, despite not being anywhere close to Dia in regards to being an abject failure, her gimmick has not been much of a success either. For now anyway, if Oyo continues to trend of Archons breaking the meta, I am optimistic about Mavuika. Aside from Emily, let's go through some other not so successful gimmicky units, a big one being Yunjin. Initially, Yunjin was seen as a good support character even though she belongs to the worst element. She can boost the attack speed and damage of normal attacks along with applying bonus damage equal to her own defense, making her an appealing choice for normal attack oriented units like Yoimiya, Ayato, and so on. That being said, she struggles in all three aspects. Power-wise, she only gives a bonus of 15% to damage and 12% to attack speed. You can get a bit more damage through a burst in A4, but if we're comparing point for point, her numbers would have to be far on levels of insane to make her a high priority candidate. Practicality-wise, Yunjin's main issue I think is her energy requirement. She wants to have as diverse of a team as possible element-wise, which means you're not generating that many geoparticles, preventing you from speccing full points into defense when you have to run stuff like Vivonius Lance and prioritize energy on artifacts. Speaking of priority, very similar to Emily, Yunjin doesn't do anything that can't be replicated by others. True, attack speed is a rare stat to have, but attack speed's ultimately just damage. You can still juice up her potential teammates with other characters that give DPS buffs like Kazuha, Bennett, Farina, Yelan, what have you. The funny thing is, despite being a normal attack boosting geo support, she's not even a priority option in mono geo teams. Bottom line, not much oomph in Yunjin's kit. She's a bit hard to itemize and there's not that much of a need for her niche. One more character I want to talk about is Candace. I brought her up a number of times in the past. She is the definition of a unit with a gimmick that no one really asked for or cares about. Her shtick is Hydro Infusion and normal attack damage boost, essentially Yunjin but Hydro Imbue and application instead of attack speed. Power-wise, Candace doesn't get you very far, not enough to justify an entire party slot. With C6, you can get a fair bit of DPS improvement, but her base strength is so weak that it doesn't change much. Practicality-wise, Candice is also torn between building for energy and building for health just to maintain her ultimate as best you can. But what makes her slightly worse than Yunjin in terms of coverage is that Candice can only infuse melee weapons, so in terms of infusion she doesn't really help too much with catalyst or bow users. Priority-wise, you're staring down the most powerful element in the game by leaps and bounds. At least for Geo, the competition's not all that stacked for Yunjin. But with all due respect, why on God's green earth would anyone even think to consider Candice when the Hydro element is full to bursting with DPS supports? Not just that, but every Hydro on fielder, Neuvillette, Ayato, Molani, and Child already deal Hydro damage by default, so her infusion is practically meaningless. Candice is not completely unusable per se. I'm sure you can run her with Arlecchino by virtue of her enabling the Harbinger to vaporize in an AoE, but you're really stretching it at that point. Arlecchino has many more options. All in all, for a gimmick to be successful, it needs to be strong, and it needs to be, needed. By being strong, it increases the necessity of it, as we can see from gimmicks like Nilu's Bountiful Bloom, but there has to be a balance. Typically, gimmicky characters are at a disadvantage when compared to more general units because they're inherently constrained. You can always make a gimmicky character top tier by giving them numbers that are so insane they just hard carry, but not only is that a lazy way of designing characters, it also exacerbates power creep. It's a very fine line between giving them enough reward to make it worth the additional effort, but not too much reward to where everyone else has to meet that standard eventually. I like what they do with Chefris actually. She's just good enough to give you an actual reason to build her and play her teams without overstepping her boundaries to force the meta in her favor. So either the payout has to be really good or you have to create a situation where they necessitate it, which I think is the approach Hoyo is taking for Nanlan's characters. Last week I made a video talking about Nanlan's whole region exclusivity where my expectation is that most Nanlan characters will be at their best when paired up with other Nanlan characters, especially when taking into account the 2 artifact sets we got. This has me believing they're gonna release a lot more gimmicky characters in version 5 and then artificially raise their value up by preventing you from capitalizing on the meta characters of version 5 without using them. For example, Molani's best teammate right now is Kachina, despite wanting nothing to do with Crystallize purely because Kachina is the only playable character who can use Cinder City, which Molani definitely wants. If Cinder City could be used by anyone, Kachina would have been a gimmicky exploration character like Sayu. Region locking enables a character to be strong and desirable without making them invasive. The end goal of a gimmicky character is to be unique enough to where they can stand out in a specific niche, but still practical enough to where there is merit to using them over a general character. Hypothetically, if Emily had some kind of party effect or special property, then in burning related comps, she would definitively be better than Nahida, Xiangling, or anyone who also could be involved in those teams. You don't necessarily have to be the only person who can do X thing, but it does help to be the best at it, and ideally having many things that cater towards that niche will lend itself to one's value. Role consolidation has only gotten more valuable over time, so if you want to make a certain gimmick your own, you have to have a mixture of quality and quantity. I do wish they can go back and retroactively buff the older gimmicky characters because I think they can afford to do so without upheaving the meta, but so long as going forward they understand how to make well-designed and practical gimmicks, I'm cool with that. But what do you guys think about gimmicky units? You're welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. That's it for today though, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFerm, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.